Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Masato. Now it is our pleasure to welcome Amir Baradaran on stage to talk about his work. Let's welcome Amir to the stage as our first keynote speaker today, this morning.
Are we ready?
Great. I think we're ready. This is for you.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right. I'm waiting for the thing to come. Sure. All right. Maybe I could just go ahead and start. I grew up in Montreal, Canada, but I was born in Iran, and my father comes from the Caspian Sea. So let me see if this works. All right, here you go. We got it. All right, awesome. So he loved to fish. The Caspian Sea is the northern part of Iran, and he loves, my father loves to fish, and he loves telling stories about fishing. So what I remember of my childhood is him going into great depth to explain what the fish was and the size of his fish. But it wasn't always the case. Sometimes the story would be like a 2-minute, and the fish would be like this. Sometimes the fish would be gigantic, as big as this, and would take on hours and hours to explain that. So one thing that really came to my mind, and I was fascinated by that, was that level of interactivity that was taking place between my dad reading the room and letting it inform his story and vice versa. And this was very much different than the way I kind of understood the technologies we had around us. If you look at motion picture defining very much our last century, if you want, in terms of storytelling, what it did is that it made us understand you make one still shot, you put 24 of them in a strip, you put them in a timeline, and here you have an idea of reality that's very different. This still shot comes from Hugo 2001, referencing the arrival of the train from end of 19th centuries by Lumiere brothers. These brothers, basically, one of the first movies that was ever made, when they projected this on screen, for those of you who have seen the movie Hugo, you would recall this. A lot of those people really got scared because they couldn't fathom the idea that there is a train coming through a projection, so they had to leave the room. And that level of fear changed how we understand reality, how we tell stories about ourselves and about others. So this has had quite a lot of enormous impact on our storytelling possibilities that we have, especially because it really created a linear narrative, right? If you look at last century's amazing software, for those of you who do a little bit of film editing, Final Cut really, eponymous with its name, really does what it does. It's a final cut. It goes frame by frame. The artist has to design and decide on every element of the aspects that goes into every moment you're going to watch. So there's this kind of major separation that happens between the artist, the author, and the audience, where a little bit like what we have right now, the audience sits and absorbs what's being told. And for me, that was very different than the way my dad was telling stories. So I decided to propose 2 big projects, one to Canada Council for the Arts for the 150th anniversary award, the other one to the Knight Foundation. And in both cases, I told them, I'm gonna tell a very intelligent story where it's going to be an immersive experience. All the characters are gonna be enabled with AI capabilities, and I'm gonna produce this for you. Obviously, they got excited, they funded me. Once I got in, actually I was in Stephen Feiner's lab at that time, and I realized that, oh my God, with the little budget that I had, it was almost impossible to be able to produce both projects because I had to hard code everything. So as a solution to that, I realized that the complexity of the environment that we had wasn't allowing me as an artist to to simply drag and drop, to simply be able to move around stories, change stories. And a lot of it is really because it's complex, because it's expensive to have hardware, it's expensive to have softwares, and it requires really my students who are engineers at grad level or undergrad level to be able to understand what's going on and tell the story with me. And the other problem that we have is fragmentation. So if you look, there are a lot of companies who are providing AI services. So you have Azure, that's the arm, the intelligent arm of Microsoft, for example, that does beautiful natural language processing, right? You have Google that does beautiful, really amazing cloud computation, helps us with storage, also does really great text-to-speech, NLP, and for those of you familiar, TensorFlow is a great tool. But all these tools really require major technological expertise. And also, there's no one who has really brought them together. So there are some stuff that Google does. There are other things that Apple does. How can we bring them all together? And that was really my goal. And in order to do that, for those of you who may know Gilles Deleuze, a great French philosopher, has said that there's no need to fear or hope, but only, and this is my little take on it, only to make tools as opposed to look for new weapons. So the tool we have created is called iBEGOO. In Persian, when you want to say, tell a story, you say, "Begoo, begoo, begoo." Tell me, tell me, tell me. So that's the name of our platform. It's a platform that allows us to create and publish immersive experiences in real time. So I would like, since seeing is believing, if we could cue the video, that would be amazing. So here you can see, you can easily create a story. You have a dialogue tree that responds not only to one item, but multiple items. We are bringing in, for example, animation from Adobe. Adobe recently purchased Mixamo. So we're bringing those services. We have text-to-speech that's done by Google. You get to choose whatever that's available. You get to play it on immediately right away to see how it sounds like. You get to have logic that tells you, hey, how conditional do you want to respond based on verbal and non-verbal, for example. So in this case, you're going to see a little story we're going to make. Do you want, to talk about Trump, or do you want to talk about somebody else? And the machine recognizes these elements, and based on the decision that you are embedding into the story, it moves forward. So really, the idea is to make it as simple as possible. This is an old UI we have. Bear in mind, we're working towards a much easier, simpler version, but I still wanted to show you a little bit how the story works. All right. So if we could go back to the slides. So the system is kind of simple. We have a web application that allows you to create the dialogue tree that you saw. There is another portion of it that allows for asset creators to gather. It's a multi-user, multi-purpose platform that create the maybe 3D models or allow that kind of connection. Whatever they make immediately becomes available in the UI for the writer or the director. We also have created the pipeline in the back. So this is cloud computation through Google that allows us to basically streamline the whole process, make the right API calls. At the very end, you press play, and you have a mobile application that gives you an AR experience that's enabled with AI. And we, really the motto that we have is sitting on the shoulders of giants. I have no interest in creating natural language processing machines. There are other people with billions of dollars who are doing that. But all those services, bringing them together, the sum of them creates something magical that's very generative, that's beyond the value of each of those separately. So iBEGOO really sits between the world of technology and the creative industry that are called prosumers, but we are hoping also to automate it a little bit more through our pipelines to streamlining better so that actually end users who have absolutely no knowledge of technology whatsoever be able to still be part of that space. And when we talk about storytelling, it's really not about entertainment or cinema alone. We can think about it in terms of any kind of content creation, right? So you could be, within the health care system, and if you want to decide how the experience should follow in terms of training your residents in getting into one room or the other, or in terms of deciding on the triage, how intelligent that environment should be and could be, what are the elements you add to it, all of this you can do through iBEGOO, and so on and so forth. So our goal is really to do data analysis and automation to push this forward in addition to a better UI. And our ideal situation would be to be able to suggest better writing practices. Because as of now, we may have had a lot of centuries working with books, telling stories, working with movies over a century now. But in terms of immersive experiences, we don't have a lot of knowledge, right? Perhaps we could bring some information about the knowledge that has been disseminated and created through theater. I think that's the closest form of knowledge that we could tap into, but still there's a lot to be learned from this space, and we are very much at the beginning of that space. For me, what's really important is to understand the role of artists. Artists are, for me, the critical thinkers of our times. And the problem is that for you to be critical, you have to be able to play, right? So if I hold a camera in my hand, I'm looking at you like the camera that's looking at me right now, right? I tell a different story than if I were to do a framing like this, right? And that understanding of representation, understanding of blocking, understanding of what stories are being told, what's in the story and what's left out of the story, was really made available to us because we started playing with that technology. We started playing with those equipments. And this is what we need. So in order to be critical, we need to play. We need to democratize access. Our education system is very much siloed. My students in the School of Engineering that I've had, a lot of them have never had any courses that they have taken on gender studies, queer studies, politics of race, and so on and so forth. So how can we really break away? How can we cross-pollinate between these different forms of knowledge that are being created so that we can all grow in a better way? And to democratize access, we also need to streamline the process, unify the platform, as I said, and make it user-friendly. For a lot of you, obviously, I'm working with AI, so there are a lot of issues around AI. Bias is a main component of that. And I'd like to talk about bias. Maybe what I would like to do in the last few minutes that I have is to run through a survey of what it means, what bias really means, and what's its impact on the kind of practices that I have. So in terms of bias for me, what matters is to say who has access and what kind of representation we have, right? If we know that less than 10% of our engineers are people from African descent, if we know that people of color, outside of those who come from international kind of environments, those who are actually from this very country, for example, if you look at the data, we see that there's very little representation of women inside our engineering schools, and which also means inside the overall world of tech. And these create problems. Why they create problems? I've come up with like this poetry that I created a while back when I was at Berkeley at some point. I call it my poets. My engineers are my poets, because for me, the form of writing codes resembles modern poetry. But more than its formal aspect, what really matters is to understand that the same way a poet pours herself or himself into the lines of text that they produce, so do our engineers. And when they do that, then the question is, who is writing our poetry? What kind of value systems are they embedding in those kind of poetries? We also need to think about the product, the process, and the purpose. So what is being aggregated? This is where you can bring in the question of feedback loop into the question. And for whom? Whose interest? We know AI right now requires gigantic, monumental, it's very capital intensive and requires a lot of money. And the companies who are doing it, as we showed earlier, these are giant companies. So if the ultimate goal is the corporate desire for growth, then maybe citizen users don't have a lot to say. So our goal is really to find ways as citizen users to interject ourselves into that space so that we don't always think about the individual, but we think about the interest of the community, or communities in this case. Now, the AI can be seen in multiple ways, right? We can look at it in different ways. Some people look at it from a very dystopian way. Some people look at it from a very utopian way. I like to be in the middle, a heterotopian way. So the same impact of AI, which is its scale, right? Back in the days, if the manager of the bank could refuse based on redlining, based on racial or gender discrimination, could stop people from having loans to have mortgage, and could stop maybe 20 people per day because each interview would take 15 minutes or so, right? Now with AI, that same kind of value system, that same discrimination will have impacts that are of gigantic scale. So this is kind of really sad in a way, but at the same time, it could be seen as something positive because we are at its very beginning of this space. And for me, I'm not too keen of this particular image. For me, it's very deterministic. There's only one line that goes into it, which is very much against everything I've been talking about throughout. But it showcases that we are very much at the beginning of that space. And for us to have a seat at the table as artists, as critical thinkers, as engineers, we have to put ourselves in that space, be able to share the resources that we have, and think about our education system doing the cross-pollination so that the wealth of knowledge that has been created throughout all the last centuries and so on and beyond that, we can incorporate that and think about our future together. So when I say I'm heterotopian, because I see potentiality in AI. AI can help us rethink authorship, rethink authenticity. What is authentic? What is objective, right? Rethink objectivity. We can think about participation and co-creation, as we talked about a little bit earlier. But the main point really for me is, what can I help you with? This is Siri. Siri, you can help me with the following. You can help me rethink consciousness and agency. You can help me think about creation and creativity. Siri, you can help me think about knowledge production and its dissemination. And by the very interesting way through which that can happen is through the fissures that AI creates in the way we understand knowledge. And one of the fissures that it creates is really to push us, move away from anthropocentric understanding of the world. And what I mean by that is a human-centric understanding of the world. The notion of I versus other has been discussed, debated for centuries. We are not alone in that space. As a matter of fact, we are standing on indigenous lands, and I would like to reckon with that and recognize that. And other cultures, other people have had other types of looking at as us, as I versus other. And if we could only kind of use this momentum that AI is creating to pull ourselves outside of that human-centric notion. Very much of it is based on a European, Western, canonical understanding of the self. If we can move ourselves away from that and look at other types of knowledge that has been there, maybe that has been pushed away, and bring those in, we perhaps could think of a better future. Thank you.